one of my colleagues, we had an all-staff meeting in Australia last month because the Institute is headquartered in Australia. And since I joined as CEO, we've had 20 new employees come to work with us from all over the world. Everybody joined in the midst of a pandemic. So we brought everybody together to meet each other in 3 dimensions in real life time. And one of the comments down there was you could tell the enthusiasm and the amount of positive energy in the room by the volume of the breaks and by the fact that it was really hard to pull people back in the room to get back to the program and the hard work discussions, given there was so much desire just to have those informal discussions. And so that's clearly evident here with us today. Just a great amount of positive enthusiasm in the room. And again, that continues out there. Hopefully there's some really good deals that are getting done over coffee and box lunch. But bringing us all back together again, thank you for taking the seats and bringing the volume down. It is on to our fireside chat portion of today's event. And it is my honor and privilege to welcome Sally Benson. Sally serves as Deputy Director for Energy and Chief Strategist for the Energy Transition at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, or OSTP. She's trained as an earth scientist and engineer. Sally's an internationally recognized expert on a wide variety of topics related to both energy and the environment and the nexus of energy and environment. For the past 25 years, she's focused on deep decarbonization of the global energy system. She comes to OSTP from Stanford University, where she is Precourt Family Professor of Energy Resource Engineering in the School of Earth, Energy, and Environmental Sciences. During her time at Stanford, she was also the director of the Global Climate and Energy Project, a research program focused on discovering and developing new technologies for reducing carbon dioxide emissions from the entire energy system. Prior to joining Stanford University, she was at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, where she held several positions, including Earth Science Division Director, Associate Laboratory Director for Energy Sciences, and Deputy Director for Operations. She's been a coordinating lead author for the IPCC and a member of several National Academy of Sciences studies related to energy and the environment. Sally is extremely well known throughout the CCS community. It's an honor and privilege to welcome you here today. Dr. Sally Benson.
Okay, thank you, Jarad, for the opportunity to talk with all of you today. And also thank you to the GCCSI, or Global CCS Institute, for all the incredible work that you've done over the years. It's my go-to source for, hey, what's new in CCS? And so your databases and reports and analysis are really a treasure trove of information. So thank you for that. So as you heard, I've been working in this area for a really long time, actually 26 years since I did the first ever study that I was asked to do related to CCS. I can say it's really thrilling to be in the room with all of you for 2 reasons. One is for all the people I know, which is always great to see my friends who've been working on this for so long and for so hard, and many of you who've had incredible perseverance through many decades. But what's really exciting is to see all of you who haven't been in the room before, because what this tells me is that what we're doing is working, that the Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure law have sent the signal that has brought people to the table where we can really begin to start deploying this technology at the scale that the climate starts to notice. So anyway, so just saying a little bit more about what I do. I lead the energy team at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. We are the science advisors to the President of the United States. And our team is focused on the 3rd leg of a 3-legged stool. So one is deployment of technologies that are available today. And we see tremendous deployment of solar and wind and electric vehicles, all growing extremely rapidly. The second leg of the stool is demonstration and the Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure law both provide opportunities for more demonstration projects, hubs for carbon capture, for hydrogen and so forth that are going to be catalytic to this important technology. And the third leg of the stool is on innovation. So we want to make sure that we can get all the way to meet the 2050 goal of net zero emissions with all the important milestones along the way. So what we do is we, again, look across the landscape of what is all the innovation needed and figure out what will it take to just push the rest of this over the top. So I want to talk about 3 major points. So the first one that I'm going to make, and actually, I don't think I even need to say this because I think you're all in the room because you already know this, but carbon capture from point sources, as well as carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere is going to be needed if we're going to limit warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees C. And the reason this is going to be needed is that it solves many of the decarbonization issues. That it can contribute to reducing emissions from electricity, but also critically important, it will play a role in industrial emissions reduction. And of course, in the long run, we are going to need to scale carbon dioxide removal so that we can get to that net zero emissions. So the second point that I want to talk more about is that now is the time to begin scaling carbon capture and storage. Well, why is that? First, the technology is really well established. You know, you can be in some communities who haven't been engaged in this 25-year journey, but we know a tremendous amount about how to get this done. Second point is supportive policies are now in place. 45Q tax credit, hydrogen tax credits. These are going to be enough to push this technology where we can begin to scale. The third point that I'd like to make is, and we've heard about it already, I think we had an excellent panel discussing this, that meaningful engagement and support of local communities is going to be essential for the sustainable scale up of this technology to get to the levels of deployment that we're going to need. And what this means is that we need to work to the highest environmental standards. We need to ensure safe and permanent storage. We need to make sure as we deploy projects that the air quality actually improves for the people who are living near these projects. And we need to have transparent and effective regulation and government oversight so that people can have confidence that these projects will be beneficial to their communities. And then finally, that scaling up carbon dioxide capture and storage and carbon dioxide removal to the 1 gigaton per year that we're going to need in the US and the 5 to 10 gigatons per year we're going to need worldwide will require cooperation between public, companies, investors, and governments to work together. So this is not going to be one and done. We still have a lot of work to do. We've heard about the challenges with financing. We've heard about capacity building. So we need to keep identifying those barriers and roadblocks and knock them down as we identify them. And we need to do it quickly because we don't have time to wait. Okay, so now I'm going to dive in a little bit deeper on some of these points. The first, again, is that carbon capture and storage is a transformational technology for meeting our net zero commitments by 2050. And we only need to look so far as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report last year, which showed that there are very, very few pathways that will let us get to 1.5 or 2 degrees C that don't include a significant component of carbon capture and storage and carbon dioxide removal. So if we look at these estimates, anywhere between 500 to 1,000 billion tons of carbon dioxide between now and 2100 will be required. Now, I want to go back in history a little bit because in 2005, the IPCC did the special report on carbon capture and storage, and it concluded that anywhere between 300 and 2,000 gigatons or billion tons of carbon dioxide capture and storage would be needed in order to meet our climate goals. So it's very interesting to see that many decades and many studies later that we're narrowing in that range, and again, in confirming the important role that this technology will play. So if we look at that 500 to 1,000 billion tons, what we're talking about is 5 to 10 billion tons per year globally. And importantly, studies from governments around the world, geologists, geological surveys, academic institutions, show that this much storage is certainly feasible. In fact, there's much more capacity than that. And that 60% of all sources, point sources of carbon dioxide emissions are within a reasonably close distance, so pipeline transport will be practical to carry out. So carbon dioxide capture and storage is also very important in meeting our US goals. So the long-term strategy for meeting the net zero goals developed by the Domestic Climate Policy Office and the State Department identifies that anywhere from 500 million to 1 billion tons per year of CCS will be needed in this country by 2050. So those are just big numbers, billion. Once you say billions or whatever, you know, it just sounds like a big number. Well, what are we talking about? We're talking about 10 to 20% of US emissions. We need to capture and store or offset through carbon dioxide removal. So that's a lot. So in the OSTP, we recently released a report, said US innovation to meet 2050 climate goals. And we looked across 37 different technologies that were identified as being important for meeting those goals that were not yet fully deployed at scale. And we did a detailed analysis looking at benefits, not only from a climate perspective, but also looking at environmental pollution, air quality, and so forth, looking at economic opportunity, looking at national security, supply chain security. And across these 37 different technologies, 12 of them were identified as transformational, meaning that they had very big benefits across many different categories, and consequently are very important to begin to make rapid progress on. And again, the reason why it's so transformational, that CCS is so transformational, is that can it result in emissions in many different sectors. So it can help to complement renewable generation to make a zero emission power grid, which is going to be one of the most consequential and substantial actions we need to take to get to net zero emissions. Second, cement, steel, chemical plants, in hydrogen production with natural gas or biomass as a feedstock. We can reduce emissions there. And again, in the longer term, as we develop this technology further and drive down costs, removing carbon dioxide directly from the atmosphere can help us offset some of those really hard to abate emissions. So the second point is that carbon capture and storage is really a well-established technology. And we've been doing CO2 enhanced oil recovery since the 1970s. This was a made in America technology and continued up until that time. But I think back to the Norwegian project, the Sleipner project, which was the first purpose-built project to capture and store carbon dioxide. That project is still operating today, very successful project with over 20 million tons of CO2 captured and stored since the beginning of that. And very importantly, why was that such an important project? It wasn't just that it was done, it was they really went above and beyond to make an enormous amount of data public so that academics and NGOs and industry could take advantage of all the learning that happened there. And there was many critical technologies in terms of monitoring and so forth that they developed and demonstrated. So a very successful project. So today, I'm sure you all know this, we have got 30 CCS facilities keeping about 42 million tons of CO2 from being emitted into the atmosphere. That's important. And the technology is also really well established because thousands of academic, national lab, and corporate scientists and engineers have shown this can be done safely. And Jarad, you and I were talking, we have 3 generations of academics, here in the room. There are people who did their graduate studies on CCS technology who are now leading companies and leading efforts. So there's a huge foundation of knowledge here. And it's not just CCS specific knowledge. Actually, where did we really learn about the processes that keep CO2 trapped safely underground? Well, groundwater hydrology and soil sciences. These are century-old studies. So again, a very, very strong foundation, and that all of the physical and chemical processes responsible for secure and permanent storage are very, very well established. And to adding to our readiness, the US Department of Energy supported 7 regional CCS partnerships for 20 years. From my perspective, it may have been the single most important thing because they really built the local capacity. They reached out to the local geological surveys and industry and really helped establish the local knowledge that was going to be needed to scale this. But it wasn't just the Department of Energy. The US Geological Survey did a completely independent assessment of the capacity to store CO2 in the United States and confirmed that very large capacity was available and helped identify those most prospective regions for doing that. And the EPA began working more than 15 years ago to establish regulations for overseeing this that built on a long history of underground injection control program. So, do we know absolutely everything we need to know? Well, clearly we're going to continue to learn more, but we're certainly ready to get going and scale up. So the third point I want to make, and again, we talked about this more, is that meaningful engagement and support of local communities is essential. So what does that actually mean? We need to begin by putting communities' interests front and center in siting decisions, because they are going to be most effective. And we need to make sure that communities can participate in environmental governance and support these projects. We need to make sure they're not exposed to unsafe water or air quality emissions. And we need to make sure that communities benefit from the jobs and economic project, not only from the CCS projects, but all of the other follow-on activities that can be present as well. And we need to be trustworthy and trusted partners so that not only can we do a project in one location, but that we build that track record of success and confidence that allows us to scale. And so what does this mean? This means holding ourselves to the highest environmental standards and going above and beyond to provide easy and transparent access to the data that community members are interested in. Now, some of these things may not be comfortable. They may be different than the way we've been doing things in the past, but we're at a very critical juncture where we're talking about the scale up of something that's critically important for meeting our climate goals, but also critically important in terms of creating jobs and US competitiveness and really providing opportunities for energy communities around the world. And we need to look beyond just the CCS project. So imagine you do a blue hydrogen project. So you in a community, right? So you've got that project. Well, now you've got all this clean hydrogen. Well, let's make sure that some of those jobs using that clean hydrogen are in that community too, so that that CCS project is not the only value that we get, but it's catalytic for more economic opportunity to make sure that the benefits really are above and beyond the CCS project alone. So an example, if we're using CCS for electricity, well, let's work on electrification of some industry in the community. Or again, as I said, if we're producing hydrogen, let's make sure that there are local opportunities to use that hydrogen to create good paying jobs. And I think this has been one of the things that I've observed is that we often look at every CCS project on its own individual merits. But in reality, if you've got clean hydrogen, well, that means you can have clean steel, and that means you can have clean cement, and that means you can have clean chemicals. So let's go above and beyond and not just look at each project on its own merits, but look at the collection of projects and think about how together these are going to drive improvements in air quality and create really vigorous opportunities for economic development. So the final point I'd like to make before sitting down with Jarad is that scaling up CCS at the pace needed to meet our net zero goals will require working together, as I said, across communities, governments, industry, and nonprofit. And having been around for 25 years, you know, CCS has been really on a roller coaster. And for all of those of you who are new to this room, it's fantastic to have you here. But you need to understand that there have been starts and stops along the way that has lost the confidence of some communities. And we need to build that back. So in spite of the ups and downs, actually, CCS grew at around 10% a year for the past couple of decades. You know, that's good, but it's not nearly fast enough. We need to grow at twice the pace. And it's not just growing at twice the pace, it's sustaining it for another 3 decades is what we need to do. And it's important that we get to work on this because the amount of warming depends on cumulative emissions, right? It doesn't just depend on emissions in any year. So the longer we wait to deploy CCS, the greater the climate damages will be. So it's time to stop kicking the can down the road. We need to accelerate the projects that pencil out today, projects with community support, so we can create that track record of success, technical success, financial success, community success, and environmental success. And of course, the government has a critical role to play in this. And I can assure you, as my colleague Sarah also, I think can help you assure you while she was in the White House, is that we are working across the government on all fronts to make sure that the provisions in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act are successful. So I said we need to work together. You know, as you identify barriers, let us know. Let us get to work on those challenges. And many of you we have spoken to. We really welcome those conversations. We also need to build these bridges with communities to make sure that the technology can be deployed safely and effectively. So it's great to be here. I'm looking forward to a conversation with all of you and Jarad, and thanks a lot.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Sally, very much for being with us here today and those framing remarks, right? That holistic, you know, all-in system perspective of how all of these pieces fit together. Where does CCS fit in that global context in terms of that all of the above solution to mitigating climate change and also balancing the energy needs of society going forward? I've been looking forward to this conversation for a long time. And again, I think many of our audience have as well. So I've got a couple of intro, questions to start this going. And I think Sally and I both want to get as very quickly as we can to questions on your mind in the audience, both here and in the virtual realm. And, one of the framing comments that you made, Sally, in terms of all of this analysis, all of the IPCC analysis going back for a couple of decades, painting the critical need for CCS to be an appropriate part of that overall solution, grounded in academically rigorous math and science. And so, you mentioned that the climate math shows we need to get to gigatons of both point source carbon capture and storage and gigatons of carbon dioxide removal. Taking your energy systems perspective and view, where do you see the synergies between developing and deploying and growing exponentially point source carbon capture and exponentially growing the carbon dioxide removal aspects as well?
Yeah. So the way I look at this is that, at the end of the day, the balance between capture from point sources and carbon dioxide removal is going to come down to economics, right? And so we want to identify those most cost-effective solutions. That's what's good for society. That's, what's good for our pocketbooks and so forth. So the question of is, how fast will costs drop in carbon capture from point sources, and how quickly will it drop from the direct air capture? And I think that's sort of where you see the first synergy, because at the end of the day, improvements in one set of technologies are likely to spill over to the other. So I don't see them as completely separate tracks on the capture side. So I see a lot of synergies there. I think the second area where they're very interesting synergies is in regional storage hubs. Right. So, if you can have a regional hub, it can be, more efficient use of pore space, more efficient use of the capacity for siting and operating those facilities. And one can imagine in the early days, we use a regional hub for capturing from point sources, but at some point in the future, that could then be available for direct air capture sites, and that would make it that much easier, right? Because you've already characterized the site. And once you start injecting carbon dioxide underground, that is really your the ultimate test, and gives you all kinds of insight into what the subsurface is like. And so if you de-risked the storage, particularly very large storage sites, that can be very beneficial. Also, looking at monitoring, that's going to be a very important part of projects. So to the extent that both direct air capture and point source capture are done in the same place, you can leverage the monitoring that you're doing. And of course, just the know-how and building that community and siting projects, operating projects, monitoring projects, both of them, are bound to be of great benefit to the other one.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. And I think, on that shared infrastructure you mentioned in hubs and the synergies thereof, I think the Institute globally is tracking, several dozen hubs that are being progressed in various stages all around the globe. And as, part of our conversation earlier in the day, the entire, world and the climate community is looking here in the United States across all forms of low carbon, with the Inflation Reduction Act really being catalytic. But there's much forward progress that's being unlocked and supported by governments and policy tools globally. In that regard, from your perspective, where are some of the other regions that you're keeping tabs on and looking for in terms of CCS deployment in the near term?
Right. Yeah. I mean, certainly Europe. And, I talked about Norway earlier, but Norway, the UK, the Netherlands, a lot of things, in progress for that next wave of deployment. So they're very important. They've also done important work on regulatory issues around capture systems that have been a great example to point to as we think about deploying these sources. How will that change air quality emissions when you switch from a regular emission source to one that's got carbon capture on it? The other place, a number of places, the Middle East, it's really encouraging to see continued development there. They were actually an early mover on the IPCC report that led to the 2005 report on carbon capture and storage. Obviously, the steel project, refinery projects, and so forth. Canada, our neighbor, again, a good partner in doing a lot of interesting work and sharing a tremendous amount of information that's been beneficial to us. Australia, both with regard to large scale projects that it's deployed and has in the pipeline, but also the really excellent work at the Otway project, that a lot of the basic science around monitoring technologies have been developed. And then where else? I mean, for me, China, China is the single largest emitter, very young coal fleet, continuing to put in more coal plants. So that's an area, we really need to see action, and I'd like to see more.
Yeah, it's been interesting to watch from my perspective, this exponential growth of interest at scale in China, right? Just last August, they started the first megaton per annum project. They're under construction of a 1.5 million ton per annum carbon capture project on a coal plant, and there's more going forward. So I agree. I think you can't solve climate unless China and India and many countries like that are part of that solution set. I've got a question for you based on your earth science background. And from my view, as the global community works together to share best practices and to help, globally deploy and speed deployment of carbon capture and storage, it's relatively easy with a short time constant to move around, lessons learned on the above ground kit, right? Capturing CO2 from industrial processes at scale. What takes more time is really the work in the subsurface, understanding the subsurface and the storage opportunities, building up that government regulatory capacity, right? To build those durable policy tools. It's an appropriate role of government, right? That are absolutely required before we're going to see investment in commercialization. From your perspective and with your background, what do you think that the global CCS community could do, should do, to help really accelerate the shape of that curve in terms of the subsurface work required?
Yeah, I think, again, pointing back to the example with the Sleipner project in Norway, the ability to get access to the data from that project, the seismic data, I can't tell you, countless academic groups worked on that data, interpreting that data. It taught us so much more. Now, that's a particular geological environment. There are many, many different types of geological environments that will be used. Some are like the Gulf Coast, relatively well understood geology. Some are much more poorly understood, and so forth. So I think the more that we can invest in data sets that we're willing to share will be really important. So that's number one, letting people get access to that. The second one is computational codes, numerical simulators, that's what we call them, are a really critical part of doing the work of citing a project, predicting how big the plume will be, and so forth. And that's an area where we can continue to make advances. And so I think that code intercomparison or code development projects are one of the exciting ways that people have worked together. There's also super exciting work in artificial intelligence using a variety of techniques to basically speed up that kind of simulation capability so that you can get like 700,000 times speed up, right? So instead of being able to, do 2 or 3 simulations, you can do, 10,000. And so you can get much better probabilistic, assessment. So working with communities working with the scientific and engineering community to make those tools broadly available will be important. And I guess the final one I would point to is monitoring. We have great monitoring technology today, seismic imaging, really the gold standard, but there's also pressure monitoring and so forth. And I think as we begin to do more and more deployment, what we're going to see is we can move from episodic kind of monitoring data, which, every X, years you get a new data set, that I think there's the potential to really move towards real-time monitoring. And I think that will be super helpful for communities to, if you can say, hey, here's what's happening and make it very transparent. So I think the community can really work together on, pushing the frontier of those monitoring technologies.
Great. Well, thank you for that. And I think from my perspective as an individual, right, countries like the United States that are further ahead in this curve, right, there's an opportunity and again, a responsibility to lead the way and help accelerate, those curves in the rest of the world. All the global math says we need to find a way to get this deployed, on all continents. And that's a big part of the opportunity. And I know that's a big part of where the administration is at in terms of how can we leverage all of the forward progress we've been talking about here today in the United States. And whether it's, conversations and leadership going to the COP or just in a more general sense, what can we do to help accelerate that in a global basis?
Yeah.
Speaking of time here, I've got time running out for our conversation. We've got some questions coming up here from the audience, so please keep those going. I've got one final question for you, just maybe a quick fun one in terms of, from your perspective as an educator, right? We were talking about this early, the interdisciplinary research. Are there just a couple of real quick things that excite you in terms of the next generation that's going to come after you and I and many in the room in terms of progressing CCS? Are there academic topics, technical topics that you just find fascinating and of interest and important as we go forward?
Right. Well, number one, I think that this is the work, this is the workforce development that we're going to be needed to do. And I look to the 1970s when we started to be aware we had a lot of groundwater pollution issues. And what we did is we supported, academic departments to train multiple generations of students in groundwater hydrology, soil science, and so forth. And the way we do that is they do master's degrees, PhDs on a variety of research topics that are relevant. So I think we really need to do that same thing in carbon capture and storage, because we're going to need a lot more people who can cite projects, who can join regulatory agencies. So what's the cool science? Well, I mentioned AI. Students love to do AI these days, and we're actually just poised, I think, for a real explosion of contributions. So I gave an example in simulation technology. The same kind of things can be done for monitoring, and I think that they're just going to be absolutely transformational. Combining multiple data sets. Other things that I find exciting are, sort of the basic physics of the long-term processes that are responsible for secure carbon storage. There's still, we're very confident that the CO2 is going to be securely trapped there, but there's still interesting things about sort of the post-injection period where we can get greater insights into what to expect. So those are just a couple.
Wonderful. Speaking of a couple, we've got some crowdsourced questions coming in here. Why don't you just pick whichever one is most interesting? We'll see how many we get through.
Okay. Let me see. Yeah, maybe I'll go to the one on meaningful engagement with communities. I think that we heard earlier today that when you want to do a project, you can start with the mayor and and really understand what are the community imperatives. So I think that's great. You can also work with religious leaders. You can work with the fire department. If there's community colleges, you can work with the community colleges. So I think it starts with a deep and an open conversation about what are the aspirations of the community, but also understanding what are people worried about. And, I had a very interesting experience in California that we were working on citing a project. And we thought that they would be very concerned about CO2 storage. Turns out they were not concerned about that at all. So, no, that's not a big deal. We have natural gas here. We understand that. And what for them, they didn't want to be a magnet for more industry. It was like, oh, well, we don't want to build a power plant here. We're perfectly happy to store carbon here. So it's understanding what the community wants. And the other thing is, this is for most people an entirely new technology. It needs an investment describing what it is. And most people have no idea what's underground, beneath us, and the idea that there are all these different layers of rocks. And some of the rocks are seals and some of them are storage reservoirs. We use words like reservoirs, right? Well, what do people think about when they hear reservoir? They think of a big tank of water, right? So they think they're big underground holes, and that, and it's like a balloon. If you would prick it, it's going to come out. Well, it's not at all like that. So really investing in making sure that people have the resources, either directly from the organizations doing the project, or even providing support where they can go get their own experts to learn about the basic science of carbon capture and storage.
Yeah, no, I think absolutely critical. And I think, the conversation of how do you take a complex subject, right, and then distill that down into a conversation, choosing your words wisely, having that 100% factually correct, and then finding the best positioned people to engage in that conversation and to carry that message. We all in this room need to work to find the most efficient and effective ways to do that. Another question for you from the audience.
Okay, what do you think CCS developers should be doing more of or better? I think that there's always the challenge of tension over costs of projects, and developers are always, having to make a decision about, how do you keep costs down so that you can actually get the project done, and and then the benefits of higher investments. I think for these early projects that it is going to pay back in a big way to make sure that we, have, maybe more than the minimum amount of data to show that a project is performing as we expect. I think that, going that extra mile to make sure it's the best project it can possibly be is something we should think about, and that sort of taking a more expedient approach, and figuring out, what is the most cost-effective way we could do it, might in the long run not be the best decision. So I think understanding that we're at the very beginning of something that feels like a big change to people, even though we know a lot about it, but and being sensitive to that, and making the extra effort in communications and accessibility of data.
I think that message has come through loud and clear. And I know our colleagues in the Department of Energy have heard that directly loud and clear in terms of how do you maximize the data that is shared in an open and transparent manner. I know it was one of the recommendations that came from, former Secretary Henry Moniz and the Energy Future Initiative report on CCS in terms of as efficiently as possible sharing that wide project data. I think that we are now unfortunately out of time. This has been such a pleasure. Thank you very much for, number one, your service to our country, your leadership in this space over the years, and for taking the time today to be with us. Thank you, Sally.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much.